Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zubko. Today we're going to speak about Australia-China relations that have been always marked by both opportunities and tensions. However, China in 2024 is not what China used to be 25 years ago. China deals with its own world superpower aspirations. Australia faces many challenges, underscored by dynamic geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific, often balancing between international trade and security. So when we have that level of complexity, we need someone who understands both countries very well. That's Philipp Ivanov. Hello, Philipp.
Hi, Martin. Good to be on the program.
Philipp is a public policy leader, strategist, and China specialist. He is a visiting scholar at the Center for Australian, New Zealand, and Pacific Studies at Georgetown University. Philipp is also involved in many policy developing and policy making procedures and processes, especially regarding China. So, Philipp, let's speak about the first question, and that's sort of a general questions that we want to answer. How would you assess the current state of diplomatic relations between China and Australia? We also know about considering those escalations that we know about. We know about trade, we know about security. But what is your general viewpoint of the current state?
Thanks, Martin. Look, China is the most complex relationship that Australia has ever faced and has ever managed. There is absolutely no precedence to the kind of complexity and multifaceted relationship and the challenge that China presents to Australia. The current description, and I'm going to borrow from our own government, of the relationship is towards stabilization. And the reason why the relations are going through this stabilization process is because over the last close to 6 years, Australia and China have very difficult relationship that was bordering on diplomatic conflict and trade contest or the trade war. Partly because of Australia's own policies, that a combination of policies starting from the 2016, 2017 and the previous governments that decided to sort of push back against Chinese influence in Australia and the Chinese policies in the Indo-Pacific region. But partly, and in my mind, the core of the change that we saw in the last 6-7 years has been the change in China itself under President Xi Jinping. So more aggressive, assertive foreign policy, the emphasis on national security, tightening domestic politics. And so as a result, the China today is very different to the China that Australia was accustomed in engaging from 1971 when Australia and People's Republic of China first established diplomatic relations. And so now, under the current government, we are on the path to stabilization. So the diplomatic relations have resumed, and the trade impediments that China introduced as a punishment for Australia's policy actions right from the 2017 to 2021 have largely been lifted. In fact, this week, one of the last remaining tariff impediments or tariff barriers was lifted on Australian rock lobster, which government has celebrated. So very complicated engagement, very complicated relationship that is not going to be easy, and it's not going to be static. Most importantly, it will always change, especially in this current geopolitical environment.
When we speak about countries with such complexities, the natural question is there a unity internal in Australia when you deal with China politically or economically?
It is more united than perhaps it was from about 2017 to the height of COVID pandemic. Uh, so when the Australian government, and it started under former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, started sort of a set of policies to push back against some of the what it saw aggressive and unwarranted parts of the China's political influence in Australia, as well as its actions in South China Sea, in Taiwan Strait, and East China Sea. The government was much more in front of the Australian public, in front of universities, in front of think tanks, in front of independent scholars of foreign policy. So back then, around 2017, there was quite significant divisions between what the government saw as the right policy settings towards China and what the parts of the society that engaged in international affairs saw was as necessary. Over the course of the last 6-7 years, and particularly with the COVID pandemic, particularly with China's response to some of the criticism of its handling of COVID pandemic by our previous government, the government of Prime Minister Scott Morrison, China introduced quite extensive trade impediments, both tariffs and non-tariff measures that affected a lot of Australian exports. And so the public mood, as well as the, I guess, elite consensus on China has also started to change towards more negative perception. You know, if you look at the our Lowy Institute polling, the public perceptions of China had been really in decline from the peaks of the mid 2010s when the relationship was at its zenith. And so I think if you're talking about now, there is a general agreement between business, government, civil society, that China presents not just the economic opportunity, but also presents a very big risk. And so I think in my mind, in my observation, there is that unity about China. But of course, there is a substantial part of our community, particularly our business community, understandably sees China as the greatest market that ever existed for Australian products. And it is true. Very hard to replace China in many of the trade commodities that Australia exports, particularly coal and iron ore, as well as agricultural products. And so there is that segment of the society that sometimes pushes the government towards more conciliatory posture towards China. And so it's a very difficult balance for the government to maintain. But generally, to answer your question, there is a much greater awareness of China risks than before, before COVID pandemic.
Internationally, we know that Australia is involved in Quad and AUKUS alliances, which are underscored by some security arrangements and agreements with the partners. But China is more involved with Russia when it comes to security and international security cooperation. So how would you describe that involvement of Australia in Quad and AUKUS as an influence on Australia-China relations?
So Australia's response to China's rise and assertiveness and the change in Chinese policies the national security, foreign economic policies of President Xi Jinping's era has been twofold. One is a deeper enmeshment in the US alliance system, which you will see in the AUKUS agreement, in Quad, in bilateral relationship with the United States, and greater defense cooperation with the United States. So we are very clearly in the United States camp when it comes to the competition between China and the United States. There is absolutely no doubt about that. In fact, I would argue that Australia has never been more integrated in the US defense system in the Indo-Pacific than it is now. And that trajectory will only continue. So that is our response to the rise in Chinese power, to the rise in influence, economic security influence of China in the Indo-Pacific, in the Pacific Islands, in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia as well. Second part of that equation, of course, is we try to straddle between the two worlds. We understand that our economic relations with China, 27% of our trade goes to China, is absolutely fundamental to our prosperity, security, resilience. And so the government has made a significant effort to stabilize the relationship with China, so that trade is going because it's critical to our future. And despite our efforts to diversify from China, it hasn't been easy. In some commodities, it was possible. But in our major commodities like iron ore, like agricultural products, the diversification is still very problematic. So we're kind of balancing those two forces. But on a fundamental reading of Asia, of the Indo-Pacific, is that the contest between the United States and China is inevitable. We want that contest to be managed carefully by both Beijing and Washington. We don't want to be involved in that conflict. But we are in alliance with the United States. And so we have essentially taken side in this conflict or in this competition. It's not yet a conflict, it's a competition. So that's kind of where we sit, and it's reflected in all our policies, whether it's South China Sea, whether it's AUKUS, Quad. The ideal Asia, the ideal Indo-Pacific that Australia wants to see is the one where the US primacy is maintained, and there's a balance of powers. And not one power dominates. And so that's kind of the ideal scenario. And, all Australian policies, in Asia are sort of working towards that objective.
And when Australia joined those initiatives like Quad and AUKUS, did you experience any security threat, perhaps some announcement or some messages from China like please don't do it, it's not going to be good for the Indo-Pacific, or some sort of narrative in that way? I'm asking because sometimes you have a sort of rhetoric reaction, but then you must also observe and research specific steps what the country is doing in international security.
Well, China has been very strong in its condemnation of AUKUS. It thinks that it accelerates the arms race in Asia and globally because it involves the United Kingdom, so a European country essentially. It sees that as a way to encircle China. It sees it as a way of creating another Anglosphere, because the three countries of English Anglo-Saxon variety. So it sees it as creating another sort of a NATO-like structure in Asia. It also doesn't like Quad, and it's been very strong in its condemnation of Quad. It also sees it as a sort of as a vehicle to encircle China. It involves its sort of old adversary, Japan. It involves its current adversary or competitor, United States. And it has India, which China also has a number of conflict and competitive flashpoints with, and Australia. So China is clearly and quite openly, publicly against those initiatives, and it sees that as sort of, as they describe, as a Cold War mentality and creating these competitive blocks where they don't need to be. I think the government acknowledges that China is unhappy, but I don't think that changed the trajectory of those groups or the interest of the countries that are involved in those groups to continue doing that. Ultimately, the explanation that we have for this, that these groups, these alliances, are a response to China's aggressive behavior in the region. So, whether that's, there are different lenses and perspectives to look at it, but that's how we see it, and that's how China sees it.
Right. The other question that we should clarify and explain a little bit is the Belt and Road Initiative. Some people consider Australia as a part of it because Australia has a sort of significant international trade with China, as we already stated. But on the other hand, some people think Australia is not a part of a Belt and Road Initiative because it doesn't align politically with China. So let's shed some light on this, and maybe from your perspective as an interdisciplinary scholar and practitioner, what is the impact of the Belt and Road Initiative on the Australia-China relations?
Great question. Well, first of all, Australia has never been officially a part of the Belt and Road Initiative. We had a case of when one Australian state, which has its own government in our system because it's a federation, has sort of publicly expressed its interest to be a part of Belt and Road Initiative, but there was never Australian government policy, and so officially we've never been a part of BRI. Second is BRI is, a signature policy of President Xi Jinping to essentially create a multipolar world, in his words, but the world which is connected to Chinese capital, to Chinese rules and standards, and to Chinese infrastructure. It's a very ambitious initiative, although in the last few years, particularly since the global pandemic, it seems like the Chinese system has sort of toned down the rhetoric about Belt and Road Initiative. But nevertheless, it is still going ahead. The roads are being built, the infrastructure is being built, the digital infrastructure is being built all across Asia, particularly with the countries that are part of the BRI, like Pakistan, for example. And so it's an inevitable feature of Asia, the region where we are, that China, in its system and its sort of ecosystem of roads, of digital infrastructure, of pipelines, of railways, is going to connect various parts of Asia. Of course, BRI has mixed successes, and it's been under a lot of criticism. particularly for, excessive, unsustainable landing. Projects are not being completed on time. The quality of the projects, infrastructure projects, have not been great. But nevertheless, it's made some progress. It's made some mistakes, and China continues doing that. And I think the Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the war in Ukraine actually, in some way, accelerated that cooperation on Eurasian infrastructure, particularly between Russia, Central Asia, and China, because that is the biggest part of BRI, that Eurasian infrastructure. Australia has been very cautious publicly to endorse BRI as a sort of as something that is good for the world and something that is good for Asia. Cautiously, it sort of supports the fact that Asia is becoming more interconnected, and the interconnectedness has always been a part of our agenda as well. But it's cautious about China's motivation in investing in BRI projects. It thinks, Australia thinks that China is also investing in its own influence in the countries that become BRI partners. And so it never really got engaged in BRI projects actively, but it sees it with certain degree of suspicion, and particularly in the countries where we have some strategic interests, particularly in the Pacific, in the South Pacific. So in PNG, in Samoa, and Fiji, whether they're officially part of BRI or not, but China's push to build infrastructure to export its infrastructure standards has been viewed with some suspicious in Canberra, in Australia. So it's a complicated relationship in the sense that Australia has never really got on board of BRI, and but it also understands quite clearly, including in the Pacific, that it's very hard for us to compete with China when it comes to building infrastructure, because they're just much better and bigger at doing that.
And also there is a interesting factor that I discuss with my students, and that's the response to BRI. What can you actually do as a country? We had a similar cases in European Union, for instance, in Italy. Do you think that Australia has responded to BRI in those strategic interest countries by strengthening, for instance, partnership between Australia and the other country?
Yeah, look, definitely we've taken a more active approach than just to say, well, China is good at building infrastructure, we're just going to roll with it. No, that's definitely not the case. And it's seen in a couple of examples of Australian policies. One is Australia has been the first country to ban Chinese telecommunication giants Huawei from building our 5G infrastructure network. And that sent a very strong signal to the rest of the world about risks associated with Huawei and risks associated with Chinese involvement in the critical infrastructure of a nation, especially the nation that is not on the same page with China when it comes to foreign policy and the world order. So that's one example where Australia has been almost a pioneer or in the front of the pack. Second, and that is not a good example, is Australia has leased, although not on the part of any BRI or any other sort of bilateral agreement, there was purely a commercial deal. Australia leased one of its ports, Port of Darwin, to a Chinese entity or Chinese affiliated entity. That, the commercial deal itself has gone through all the necessary approvals, but after it was approved, it actually generated quite a lot of debate in the national security community, particularly because of the strategic position of Darwin Port in the North Australia, very close to Indonesia, and also very close to US Australia joint military facilities in the Northern Territory. So at the moment there is a process underway that I predict will kind of claw back the ownership of the port back to Australia. But on paper, the port is still a part of the Chinese company ownership. And then another example is, while the current government of Prime Minister Albanese has been stabilizing the relationship with China, simultaneously, it has been working very hard in the Pacific and in Southeast Asia to, I guess, to compete with Chinese influence, particularly in the Pacific, and re-establish Australia's credentials as a major power in the Pacific region, and sort of warn the governments of the Pacific Island states that the China or the over-dependence on Chinese investment on Chinese infrastructure may cause some problems down the track. And so these sort of three examples, I guess, show that Australia hasn't been a passive observer of what China is doing in the region, especially when it comes to economic integration and connectivity. So we see it, Australia sees it in terms of through the lens of risk management first and foremost, rather than a pure commercial economic opportunity and inability to compete with China on that scale. Yes, in some way we cannot compete, but it doesn't mean that we should be passive and let China shape the region around us.
Absolutely, the active policy is always welcome when it's smartly implemented. So that's, I think, the way how you can respond to Chinese BRI. When we speak about China, Australia, we can't skip one of the most important country, and that's the United States. And we already mentioned the security initiatives where the United States play the main or major role. But what about political, maybe trade, maybe some other aspects of the involvement of the United States in China and Australia relations? And also, how do you see the sort of like complications, which means American elections? If Trump is going to be elected or Kamala Harris is going to be elected, how that can influence the role of the United States in sort of triangle Australia, China, and the United States?
Yeah, that's the number one question at the moment. I'll start again by reiterating that Australia has made it clear that in the competition between China and United States, which is essentially a competition that will define the 21st century. Australia is clearly in the US camp. We are one of the closest allies of the United States in the region, and that cooperation on all fronts, political, economic, strategic, technological is accelerating. So second is United States has clearly decided over the last, particularly over the last 3 years, I would say, that China is its biggest competitor, and to stay on top of the power ladder, global power ladder in technology, in defense, economy, as well as in the strategic space that is so important to the world, which is Indo-Pacific, it must compete with China. That policy is bipartisan. It's probably the only thing that both parties agree on, is a competition with China. It's also a very comprehensive, systematic change of the US system. And having been there for the last 2 years in Washington and New York, I was quite amazed by how fundamentally the US system has changed and now geared towards competition with China. And so, regardless of who wins the White House in November, I think that part of the overall direction of the United States is not going to change. I think Kamala Harris and Donald Trump will have different style, will have different temperament, probably will use different tools in competition with China. We know that President Trump is fond of using trade measures, how he describes as a trade war or trade competition as the way to sort of compete with China. I think President Biden and Vice President Harris are sort of more interested in the systemic competition across the technology domains and economic domains. So the style, some policies will be different, but I think the trajectory of US policy, which is to compete and counter where necessary, China in Asia is pretty set. And so Australia, as well as other countries in the region particularly, and probably some of the other interesting examples are Korea, Japan, Singapore, Philippines, find themselves in this sort of interesting space where, of course, they're part of the US alliance system, but they also have incredibly close and multidimensional trade relationship with China. And so the competition is fine as long as it doesn't become a conflict. And, the conflict over Taiwan, for example, will be absolutely catastrophic for Australia because so much of our trade goes through there. The same can be said for South China Sea. That's why we're so engaged in the South China Sea policy issues, because so much of our trade, maritime traffic, goes through the Malacca Strait and through South China Sea that we're so dependent on it. And so we are fine with cold competition as long as it doesn't spill into conflict, because in this case, Australia, as part of the US defense system, global defense system, and we are very much embedded into it, will be forced to join one side of the conflict, which will be absolutely catastrophic for us and for the region and for the world, for that matter.
Definitely, and war always brings surprises and usually unpleasant ones. So that's also sort of risk that we might face. Philip, let's speak a little bit about trade between China and Australia. And I think there are two things we could explain here. The first one is the level of dependency on Chinese market for Australia. And the second one may be logical question how to diversify that dependency. And maybe you can also elaborate a little bit which sectors are mostly affected by Chinese market.
So the Australia-China trade story is an incredible story of complementarity and of political will of both Chinese and Australian government, as well as the business community, to build this remarkable relationship that still exists. It's still in a very good shape, despite all the troubles over the last 6-7 years. And it's built on, I guess, on a number of factors. Australia's top 3-4 exports to China: iron ore and coal and LNG, and the international student services, which is international education, fluctuates, but it's all often has been in the top 5, top 4. And then closely followed by the agricultural exports. So from wheat to barley to soy to seafood. So the trade relationship has been built essentially on two main factors. One is, of course, the complementarity. So China's economic boom over the last 40 years required a huge amount of steel. And Australia is one of the world's highest quality producers of iron ore. And so iron ore remains our top export by a large margin. China has also, as its development progressed, needed more energy, and Australia has provided that energy and also allocation in Asia. And the quality of our energy has been consistent, and which China, of course, has taken advantage of. And then, as Chinese middle class has expanded, so its demand for high quality food products. And China has always been very sensitive about food security. And so Australia, as a big agricultural producer, has taken advantage of that. So that's generally our the profile of our relationship with China in terms of trade. So as of now, I think the latest figures are that 27% of Australia goods and services trade with the world in 23 is with China. And it's actually, the trade has increased by 10% in 2023. The services trade is really predominantly driven by tourism. So Chinese tourists come into Australia, and students. And we count students as part of the export of services. And that's been also very successful commodity, so to speak, so both tourism and international education. At the moment, international education, I think, is our 4th largest export. So when China introduced its trade impediments, they targeted mainly agricultural producers. So wine, barley, beef. The only non-agricultural commodity that they targeted was coal. In most of the cases, Australian producers were able to diversify very quickly. One exception is wine. Wine was very difficult to diversify, partly because of the Chinese consumers were prepared to pay a premium price and the market was so big. But in the case of some commodities like, for example, barley, the Australian producers found other markets relatively successfully. So the hit to the trade was sizable, but it not overwhelmingly significant. So Australia is immediately, particularly the government, as well as, of course, the producers, have immediately, injected resources and as well as introduce policies to allow for that diversification to happen. And it did happen. But China is such a large market, such a dominant market. It's also such a sophisticated market that when the trade measures or when the trade impediments were lifted in the last 12 months, the producers returned to the Chinese market. So diversification happened, but now we are largely back to where we were. And of course, China never targeted the commodities like iron ore because it will hurt itself more than it will hurt Australia. So they've been very clever and strategic and pragmatic about it. So it's a story of the yes, diversification is possible, it's needed, it's happening in some way, but there is, unfortunately, in most of these commodities that we sell, there is no alternative to China in terms of scale and in terms of price. And so that is kind of where we are now. So the current debate in Australia is actually not about diversification. I think the government wants to continue with diversification, but our business leaders, our companies are worried about the weakening Chinese economy, because in some way a bad Chinese economy will affect Australia much more significantly than China's punitive trade measures against Australia. So that's because a weak Chinese economy means a decline in iron ore prices, means decline in energy prices, and that's really bad for Australia. And so that's kind of where we find ourselves today.
Right. That's a very interesting story. And I was also listening to some other commentators, and they expressed sort of concern about the sort of education in Australia that Chinese people are taking, or they are enrolled in those classes, and regard of national security and so-called reverse engineering. Do you have any information about how is the debate about this topic in Australia?
So I'm actually just about to present a paper at the Australian International Education Conference about Australian universities and geopolitics. And of course, the relationship with China, the education relationship with China is a big part of that discussion. I'll start with, I guess, with a couple of observations. One is, as Chinese economy grew right from the reform era of 1980s and 1990s, so is demand for higher education. And Chinese universities, while they are, now really world-class institutions, they still cannot meet the demand for higher education in China. So China has, through policy measures, but also through just the sheer demand from young people has been a net exporter of students to the world, not just to Australia, of course. You know, the United States is the largest importer of these students. So, and Chinese students and scholars globally, I think, have been fundamentally good for the world and good for countries like Australia, US, Canada, UK, you know, and many other countries. So I think it's, you know, to me, that's a sort of where we should start that discussion. I think that flow of people to and from China, or from China to the world, has been very positive for both China and for us. Um, Second is, of course, the Chinese system has been geared, you know, right from again from the 80s and 90s towards learning technologies, know-how, IP from the West, you know, or you know, to a lesser degree, Japan and Korea and other sort of more developed countries in the world, and then use that IP to build its own capabilities in manufacturing, in technology, science, etc. And you know, they have succeeded in that. How much of it has been obtained illegally, you know, through spying, through intelligence gathering, is very hard to determine. How much of it came just via educational, scientific, people-to-people exchanges and globalization, you know, and the Western firms, you know, relocating their manufacturing capabilities to China and the facilities and factories. So my guess, based on you know, data that I have seen, is that, you know, the majority of the capabilities that have been acquired by China in, you know, I'm talking about economy and trade, or less so national security and defense, have been acquired through, you know, open exchanges and scientific as well as educational exchanges. And so, of course, there are incidents that are very worrying of cooperation in between Australia and China in sensitive technologies and critical technologies that, you know, led to those technologies being used by the People's Liberation Army or in national security. That is definitely a concern, and it definitely happened. And I suspect it might still be happening. And so Australian government and universities are working pretty closely to sort of stop these kind of incidents from occurring. But I doubt that this is a mass scale dynamic or mass scale issue. And so there are sensitivities about cooperation with China, and I think the recent data shows that the research collaboration with China have been declining from 2016, 2017, which is part of that trend, but part of that risk management. But the Chinese enrollments are very strong, and especially they bounced back after the pandemic. And the demand for Australian education is still there. And in fact, the government is now trying to limit some of these enrollments, not just Chinese, but any international enrollments, because Australian universities enroll a lot of international students, and that creates certain tensions. But so I think that fundamentally the education relationship is good for Australia. It needs to be sustainable. It needs to be brought into a context where it doesn't damage other or doesn't create problems for other students. It doesn't create any problems in terms of cooperation with China on sensitive technologies. We don't want that to happen. But I think fundamentally the education relationships and Chinese students and scholars have been great for Australia.
Philip, when we speak about Indo-Pacific and trade, there are often so many comments about multilateral agreements and various institutions. But then, for instance, my students, they were struggling a little bit about finding benefits of those multilateral agreements and institutions for a particular country. So how do you see the Australia-China relations as bilateral, for instance, international trade, political relations and diplomacy, versus multilateralism in Indo-Pacific? Do you see any major benefits for Australia? Or do you think that it's much better to develop bilateral relations with China?
Um, Look, it's slightly outside my expertise, but I'll make just a couple of observations. First, that contested geopolitics of Asia that we see now has made multilateral cooperation with China very difficult for Australia. You compare it at the time when the global financial crisis, where China's stimulus, for example, that was, encouraged by G20 countries, has made a very positive impact on the world. It's very hard to imagine that if there is a global financial crisis happening now, that we will see multilateral cooperation or China's willingness to do something in multilateral forums will be possible because of the geopolitical contest between the United States and China. Australia is a free trader, or it's a nation that is really committed to free trade. Was one of the pioneers of free trade, including through multilateral platforms like what used to be known Trans-Pacific Partnership and RCEP, as well as other trade agreements. So it's still, we are very much reliant on international trade and a multilateral trade system that is healthy and is workable. But I don't think there are any illusions now in Australia about real utility of multilateral trade when clearly the issues of economic security, economic sovereignty, protectionism are on the rise. And it started, with China's rise, but it also was accelerated by COVID-19 pandemic. And so I just think that Australia publicly is, of course, supportive and hopeful that multilateral trade system will continue and will not completely disintegrate, and it hasn't completely disintegrated. But I think quietly it's skeptical how it will survive the US-China competition, as well as our own kind of economic security agenda. The current government of Australia has announced this big policy called Future Made in Australia, which is essentially about investing in our own local manufacturing capabilities. It's about patching up supply chain vulnerabilities and risks. It's about friendshoring and onshoring. It's about creating deeper trade relationships with the countries that are our friends, United States, Japan, others, kind of United Kingdom. So that policy sits quite uncomfortably with the overall philosophy of multilateral trade, where the system is equal for everyone, regardless of their political or foreign policy direction. So, how this kind of economic security agenda coexist with trade, so far it's been relatively successful, I guess, the coexistence, but it's getting tested uh, over and over again. You see it in US and Canada banning Chinese electric vehicles, or not banning, but increasing the tariffs for Chinese EVs. So that is an example of that tension between the global multilateral trade system and the economic security agenda.
Let's finish this interview with one of the most difficult questions, and that's about energy security cooperation between Australia and China, because there are many interesting dynamics going on. We know about some LNG projects in Australia being postponed. We know about some campaigns against exporting coal or LNG to China. And we know about some campaigns calling for Australia to strictly stick to renewable energy. So let's put this topic all together, Philipp, and let's hear from you your thoughts, maybe some implications about this topic.
Australia has an ambition, or stated ambition, to be a renewable energy superpower because of our abundant resources in solar, in wind. The trouble, of course, is that to be the renewable energy superpower, we need cooperation with China because China is the renewable energy superpower in terms of its technologies, scale, affordability, from solar panels to batteries to electric vehicles. And so that is, I think, probably one of the most promising areas of the relationship. We have the resources, the sun and the wind. China has the tech. China has the scale. China has manufacturing capabilities. So it's really it's a match made in heaven. But then geopolitics interfere, and so the overall kind of caution and risk management about trade and over-reliance on China will make this cooperation quite difficult. But in theory, if you take the geopolitics out of it, and of course you can't, I think that is where Australia and China and many of our scholars, including Australian National University scholars that published this report about the Australia-China economic relationship, they point out to the fact that the renewable energy cooperation between Australia and China is one of the most promising high potential areas. But our relationship with the United States, geopolitical tensions with China, that suspicion about over-reliance on China is going to hold that cooperation back. But I think it's a very interesting story to watch.
Absolutely, and I think it's also a very interesting research topic for junior students, for researchers, because more information, more perspectives we have, we might make better decision and maybe better foreign policy in that sphere of energy. So that's very interesting. Philipp, thank you very much for your insightful thoughts and experience that you share based on your practical experience and practical life involvement in policy decision-making processes, because international relations I always consider as an interdisciplinary field. So China, Australia, I think will remain one of the most attractive research topic for academia, but also for business practitioners. Philipp, thank you again for being on Our Thinker.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. It was really great speaking with you. Thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure.